You were taught that the American Revolution began with an idea, that a group of principled men read John Locke, decided that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and picked up muskets to defend that principle against a tyrant 3,000 miles away. It is a beautiful story. It is also, in the way it is usually told, a story with a hole in the middle of it the size of an empire. Because if you actually sit down and read the private letters, the ledgers, the land grants, and the debt records of the men who started this revolution, you find something far less noble and far more human. You find men who were, in many cases, broke, men who were blocked from land they considered theirs, men whose fortunes were being strangled by a financial system they no longer controlled. This is not a story that erases the ideals of 1776. It is a story that explains why those ideals found such fertile ground among a very particular class of colonial Americans at that very particular moment. And once you understand the economics, the politics stop looking like a mystery and start looking like the most predictable thing in the world. Let's begin with a number that almost never makes it into the textbooks. By 1775, the 13 colonies collectively owed British merchants and creditors somewhere in the range of £5 million sterling. To put that into perspective, that is a debt burden roughly equivalent in relative economic terms to hundreds of billions of dollars today. And that debt was not evenly spread across a grateful, prosperous population. It was concentrated in the hands of the planter aristocracy of the South and the merchant elite of the North. The very same men who would go on to write pamphlets, organize congresses, and sign the Declaration of Independence. This is not a coincidence. It is the plot. So let's ask the question that historians rarely ask directly. Why did the men with the most to lose from British rule become the men most willing to risk everything to end it? The answer has very little to do with philosophy and everything to do with balance sheets. Start with Virginia, the wealthiest and most influential colony in British North America. Virginia's economy ran on a single crop, tobacco. And tobacco ran on a single mechanism, British credit. Planters would borrow against next year's harvest to buy manufactured goods, luxury items, and more enslaved laborers from British merchant houses. It sounds simple enough until you understand what happened when tobacco prices fell, which they did, repeatedly, throughout the 1760s and early 1770s. The debt did not disappear. It compounded. It passed from father to son like an inheritance nobody wanted. By the early 1770s, the two largest debtor colonies, Virginia and Maryland, together owed British merchants more than half of all colonial debt combined. Individual planters were drowning. George Washington himself, despite being one of the wealthiest men in Virginia on paper, was chronically short of cash and increasingly frustrated with British merchant houses that he believed were shortchanging him on the sale of his tobacco while overcharging him for imported goods. Thomas Jefferson would later write that the planters of Virginia had become, in his words, a species of property annexed to certain mercantile houses in London. Read that sentence again. The man who wrote that all men are created equal was describing his own class as property. That is not the language of abstract philosophy. That is the language of a man who feels owned. Now overlay a second grievance onto this financial suffocation: land. In 1763, fresh off its victory in the 7 Years' War, Britain issued the Royal Proclamation, drawing a line down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains and forbidding colonial settlement to the west of it. The stated purpose was to stabilize relations with Native American nations following Pontiac's uprising, and there was genuine strategic logic behind it. But for a specific group of wealthy Virginians who had spent the better part of 2 decades speculating in Western land through companies like the Ohio Company and the Loyal Land Company, the proclamation was catastrophic. These men had staked enormous sums on the assumption that the frontier would open. Washington called the proclamation a temporary expedient to appease the native tribes and continued quietly buying up soldiers' land warrants in anticipation of the ban being lifted. It was not lifted. It was, if anything, tightened. In 1774, the Quebec Act extended the boundary of Quebec all the way down to the Ohio River, permanently closing off the very land that Virginia's speculating class considered their birthright. For men like Washington, this was not an abstract insult to colonial dignity. It was the direct personal destruction of a fortune they had spent years building on paper. Before we leave Virginia, there is one more thread worth pulling, because it connects the land crisis directly back to the currency crisis, and together they form a trap with no obvious exit. In 1764, Parliament passed the Currency Act, extending an earlier restriction that had applied only to New England and now banning every colony from issuing new paper money as legal tender. On its face, this looks like a dry, technical monetary regulation. In practice, it was economic strangulation. The colonies had almost no gold or silver of their own because Britain's trade policy was structured to ensure that any hard currency entering the colonies quickly flowed back across the Atlantic to pay for British manufactured goods. Colonial paper money, backed by land and future tax revenue, had been the workaround. And in colonies like Pennsylvania, it had functioned remarkably well. Benjamin Franklin, who had spent much of his early career printing colonial currency and advocating for it in pamphlets as far back as 1729, understood better than almost anyone what its removal would do. He would later argue that the Currency Act's damage to colonial economies became one of the most significant and most overlooked contributors to revolutionary sentiment. A Philadelphia merchant named Daniel Roberdeau described the resulting cash shortage in 1767 as the worst he had ever witnessed. Farmers could not sell crops for want of buyers with money to spend. Merchants could not settle accounts. Credit, the lifeblood of any colonial economy, simply dried up. For Virginia's planters, already sinking under debt to London merchants, the Currency Act closed off one of the only remaining tools they had to manage that debt on their own terms. It is in this context that Patrick Henry, a man who would soon make himself famous with the words, "Give me liberty or give me death," joined Thomas Jefferson in the Virginia legislature in May of 1774 in proposing that the colony simply suspend all payments owed to British creditors. This was not a minor procedural motion. It was two future revolutionary leaders openly discussing debt repudiation as a political strategy, weeks before the crisis with Massachusetts pulled the rest of the colonies into open resistance. The historian John Ferling, examining Jefferson's finances, concluded plainly that for men of the planter elite, revolution was, among other things, the shrewdest available economic decision. Independence did not just promise political self-governance, it promised the chance to renegotiate, delay, or simply walk away from a mountain of debt that had become, in Jefferson's own words, hereditary from father to son. Move north to Massachusetts, and the grievance shifts shape, but not substance. New England's wealth was built on trade, and a shocking amount of that trade was, by British law, criminal. Before the 1760s, customs enforcement in the colonies was almost non-existent. Historians estimate that British customs officials collected barely £2,000 a year in duties, while the cost of running the customs service itself ran several times higher. The gap was filled by an enormous, thriving culture of smuggling, particularly in molasses imported illegally from French and Dutch Caribbean islands and distilled into rum. This was not a fringe activity conducted by outlaws in the shadows. It was mainstream commerce conducted by the most respected merchants in Boston. John Hancock, the man whose signature would later dominate the Declaration of Independence, an enormous looping script, built and inherited a trading empire substantially dependent on evading British duties. When his ship, the Liberty, was seized by customs officials in 1768 on suspicion of smuggling, it triggered riots in Boston Harbor and turned Hancock into both a political martyr and a financial casualty in the same afternoon. He was defended in court by a young lawyer named John Adams, who successfully got the smuggling charges dismissed on a technicality, a small legal victory that did nothing to reverse the financial damage of losing a ship and its cargo, but a great deal to cement Hancock's reputation as a man willing to fight the crown in public. Samuel Adams, Hancock's close political ally and the chief organizer behind the Sons of Liberty, understood something that pure ideologues rarely grasp on their own. A resistance movement needs both righteous anger and reliable funding, and Hancock, through no particular effort of persuasion, supplied both at once. It is worth pausing on this, because it complicates the tidy image of the Sons of Liberty as a spontaneous, grassroots expression of popular anger. The organization's activities, its boycotts, its printed pamphlets, its intimidation campaigns against customs officials and anyone who cooperated with them were financed in meaningful part by merchants whose businesses depended on the continuation of exactly the smuggling economy that British enforcement was trying to shut down. This does not make their stated grievances insincere. It does mean that the loudest, best organized voices calling for resistance were not chosen at random. They were the voices with the most capital, and capital, in any era, tends to find a way to make its interests sound like everyone's interests. When Parliament passed the Sugar Act in 1764, and later the Townshend Acts in 1767, tightening enforcement and expanding the power of vice admiralty courts to prosecute smugglers without juries, it was not simply an ideological affront to liberty. It was a direct assault on the profit margins of New England's merchant class, the same class that would go on to bankroll the Sons of Liberty and organize the resistance movement, that historians now remember as a grassroots uprising for freedom. And then, in 1773, came the single event most responsible for distorting how we remember this entire period, the Boston Tea Party. Ask most people what the Tea Act did, and they will tell you it raised taxes on tea. It did not. The tax on tea had existed since 1767. What the Tea Act actually did was grant the financially collapsing British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, allowing it to sell directly to consumers and bypass the network of colonial merchants who had previously profited as middlemen. This was, in the plainest possible terms, a corporate bailout. Parliament was using the power of law to rescue a failing megacorporation at the direct expense of colonial businessmen, some of whom, like Hancock, had also been profiting from smuggled Dutch tea that the East India Company's cheaper. Legal tea now threatened to undercut entirely. The tea that went into Boston Harbor on the night of December 16, 1773, was not destroyed because it was too expensive. It was destroyed because it was too cheap, and because the men whose livelihoods depended on the old system understood exactly what a state-sponsored monopoly could do to their businesses if it went unchallenged. Britain's response to the destruction of the tea was neither measured nor forgiving. Parliament passed a series of punitive measures the colonists would come to call the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was shut down entirely until the East India Company was repaid for its lost tea, a blockade that strangled the very trade the city depended on for survival. Massachusetts's colonial charter was effectively suspended, stripping the colony of self-government. British officials accused of crimes in the colonies could now be tried in England, far from local juries, and the Quartering Act forced colonists to house and feed British troops at their own expense, a hidden tax that fell hardest on ordinary working families who had no stake in Hancock's smuggling fortune or Jefferson's land speculation. What is striking, looking back, is how quickly this punishment aimed at a single port city galvanized merchants in Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston who had no direct connection to the Tea Party at all. They recognized the underlying threat immediately. If Parliament could shut down Boston's economy by decree, it could do the same to any colonial port whenever colonial commerce became inconvenient to London's interests. A crisis that began as a narrow local dispute over a tea monopoly had become, almost overnight, a continental question about who ultimately controlled colonial capital. By this point, a pattern should be emerging, and it is worth naming directly. Every major flashpoint of the pre-revolutionary period, the currency restrictions, the land proclamation, the customs crackdowns, the tea monopoly struck a specific, identifiable, wealthy interest group before it struck anyone else. The ordinary farmer, the blacksmith, the day laborer. They were affected too, but often indirectly, through inflation, through scarcity, through the general economic strangulation that trickled down from policies aimed at controlling colonial elites. The men who turned that trickle-down suffering into an organized, articulate, philosophically grounded revolution were, disproportionately, the men whose personal fortunes were on the line. This raises an uncomfortable question that deserves a direct answer rather than a dismissal. Does this mean the American Revolution was a fraud? A con job dressed up in the language of liberty to protect the wallets of a wealthy few? No, and it is important to be precise about why not. The financial motives of men like Washington, Jefferson, Hancock, and Henry do not cancel out the genuine philosophical convictions that also drove them, and they certainly do not diminish the sacrifices of the tens of thousands of ordinary colonists, farmers, tradesmen, and soldiers who fought and died with no land speculation deals and no smuggling fortunes to protect. What the financial record does is something more interesting than debunking. It explains timing. It explains why a set of philosophical arguments about natural rights that had circulated in European political thought for decades suddenly found an audience willing to act on them, immediately, urgently, and at enormous personal risk, in the American colonies of the 1770s specifically. Ideas do not cause revolutions by themselves. Ideas need a population primed to receive them, and few things prime a population more effectively than watching your land, your currency, and your economic future be dismantled by a government you have no voice in. There is also a second, quieter irony buried in this story, and it is worth sitting with before we close. The men who led the revolution framed British monetary and economic control as a form of tyranny, and in many respects, it was. Britain restricted colonial paper currency through the Currency Acts of 1751 and 1764, forcing the colonies into a punishing shortage of hard cash precisely when they needed liquidity most. Britain controlled land distribution through royal proclamation. Britain controlled trade through the Navigation Acts and an expanding customs bureaucracy. And yet, within a decade of winning independence, the very men who had rebelled against centralized financial control built a new centralized financial system of their own. The Constitution of 1787 handed the federal government exclusive power to coin money and explicitly forbade the states from issuing their own paper currency or making anything but gold and silver legal tender. Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, established a national bank, assumed state war debts at face value, benefiting bondholders who had often bought up depreciated war debt for pennies on the dollar, and built a financial architecture that concentrated monetary power in a way that would have made a British minister nod in recognition. The revolution had not been fought against the concept of centralized economic control. It had been fought against centralized economic control exercised by someone other than the colonial elite themselves. Once that elite held the reins, they did not dismantle the machine. They rebuilt it under new management with new beneficiaries. Consider what happened to the very grievances we have spent this video tracing once independence was secured. The land west of the Appalachians, once sealed off by a royal proclamation and the Quebec Act, was thrown open to settlement, And the earliest, best-positioned buyers were very often the same speculators, or their heirs, who had been blocked a generation earlier. Loyalist estates were confiscated by the new state governments and redistributed, in many cases landing in the hands of the very revolutionary leaders who had organized the confiscation. And the debts that Jefferson and Henry had once proposed simply suspending did not vanish either. They were renegotiated, restructured, and, in the case of state war debts, largely assumed by the new federal government under Hamilton's plan at face value, which quietly rewarded the wealthy speculators who had bought up depreciated bonds from struggling veterans and farmers for a fraction of their worth in the chaotic years just after the war. None of this is presented as scandal. It is simply what elites reliably do once they capture the machinery of a state. They use it to formalize and protect the very interests that motivated them to capture it in the first place. The tragedy, if there is one, is that this pattern is not unique to 18th century Virginia or Massachusetts. It is close to a universal feature of how revolutions resolve, from the Creole-led independence movements of Latin America in the following century, where local elites broke from Spain not to abolish colonial economic structures, but to run them without a European middleman, to the decolonization movements of the 20th century, where locally educated elites frequently inherited, rather than dismantled, the extractive institutions their colonizers had built. None of this should be read as cynicism for its own sake. History rewards precision, not simplicity, and the true story of the American Revolution is not a betrayal of the version most of us learned in school so much as it is a missing chapter. The chapter about ideas, about liberty, about the rights of man. That chapter is real, and it matters, and it changed the world. But it was written alongside another chapter about debt ledgers, about blocked land grants, about smuggled molasses, and about a corporate monopoly that pushed colonial merchants past their breaking point. Historians who focus only on the philosophy give you half a revolution. Historians who focus only on the money give you a cynical caricature. The truth, as it almost always does, lives in the uncomfortable space between the two, where a Virginia planter drowning in debt to London could sit down and write, without contradiction he was aware of, that all men are created equal, and mean it, while also meaning something more immediate and more personal about his own chains. So the next time you hear the American Revolution described purely as a war of ideas, remember Thomas Jefferson calling his own class a species of property annexed to London merchants. Remember George Washington buying up land warrants for Territory Britain had explicitly forbidden him to settle. Remember John Hancock's smuggling empire funding the very organization that dumped a monopolist's tea into Boston Harbor. None of these facts erase the Declaration of Independence. They complete it. They explain why, of all the places in the 18th century world where Enlightenment philosophy was being read and debated in coffee houses and salons, it was a small strip of colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, saddled with debt, blocked from land, and squeezed by customs enforcement, that turned those ideas into an actual functioning world-altering revolution. Philosophy lit the match. Economics built the powder keg it was thrown into. If this reframed something you thought you already understood, do the channel a favor and subscribe. And leave a comment telling me which part surprised you the most. And if you want to keep pulling on this thread, the video on screen right now digs into the financial engine that powered the revolution once it actually began. How a bankrupt Continental Congress managed to fund an 8-year war against the most powerful empire on Earth. I think you'll find it just as revealing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.